Hello, and welcome to Day 2 of AIUK 2022. AIUK is the UK's national showcase of artificial intelligence and data science research and collaboration, hosted by the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for AI and Data Science. This year we're back and we have more content than ever across 4 stages, so welcome to the public policy stage. We hope that you're going to be engaged, informed, entertained and enlightened by what you see and hear. I'm Timandra Harkness, I'm your host on the public policy stage. I'm a writer and broadcaster, author of Big Data, Does Size Matter, and a graduate fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. But most important of all, I am hosting your public policy stage for another day of fantastic content. We're going to have a focus on possibility, positivity, responsibility, and sessions will connect leading experts and policymakers as we discuss AI and data science's potential to improve policymaking processes and the provision of public services, while underlining the importance of AI standards, regulation, and developing ethical foundations for the use of data-intensive technologies in the public sector and beyond in policymaking. Today we've got sessions covering ethics and the latest report from the Global Partnership on AI. So first of all, we're delighted to present a brand new area of work. As highlighted in the National AI Strategy, technical standards are going to play an important role for advancing AI technologies and ensuring their effective governance. So the AI Standards Hub is a new initiative at the Alan Turing Institute dedicated to community building, knowledge sharing, and international engagement around AI standardization. So this session will explore the AI Standards Hub mission and hear experts from the organisations who are partnering to pilot the hub as they talk about their work behind the scenes and discuss the significance of technical standards for AI in the UK and internationally. Your host for this morning is Dr. Florian Ostman. Florian is Head of AI Governance and Regulatory Innovation within Turing's Public Policy Programme, and he leads the Turing's work on the AI Standards Hub. So, over to you, Florian.
Thank you very much, Timandra, and good morning to everyone who is watching. Welcome to the session. I'm delighted that you are joining us for this segment. As Timandra mentioned, the AI Standards Hub is a new initiative, one that we're very excited about at the Turing. You may have heard about the initiative before. It was originally mentioned in the government's National AI Strategy that was published last autumn, and January saw the announcement that the AI Standards Hub will be led by the Alan Turing Institute in partnership with the British Standards Institution, the National Physical Laboratory, and also working closely with government, including DCMS and the Office for Artificial Intelligence. We are still at a very early stage with our work on the AI Standards Hub. There hasn't been any public-facing activity so far. We've been very busy working behind the scenes in setting the foundations for the hub's work and working on the strategy for the hub pilot. For today's session, we would like to use AIUK as an occasion to tell you more about this initiative, to offer you a look behind the scenes, as it were, and share our vision for the initiative and also why we think it is an important project. We are also using today's session to launch a way for anyone who is interested in the hub to express their interest, to sign up for updates, and to provide input that will help us shape the work ahead. And we'll come back to that later on. We'll have a sign-up form that we will share with you at the end of my presentation. So hopefully you will leave today's session sort of sharing our enthusiasm about this new initiative and signing up to join us along the journey. In terms of structure for our session, I'm going to use the next 10 minutes or so to give you a brief overview that sets out the background for the initiative, the motivation behind it, its mission, and how we intend to pursue the mission. We'll then move on to a discussion, and it will be a great pleasure to be able to welcome 3 guests and colleagues from our partners, DCMS, BSI, and NPL, for that discussion. And of course, we look forward to your questions that we will try to answer as part of the discussion. So we'll get to the discussion later. For now, let me tell you a bit more about the Hub and what we're trying to do with this initiative. As a first step, it may be useful to say a few words about what we mean by standards in this context. The word standards is used to refer to different things, so it's worth clarifying what kinds of standards will be the focus of this initiative. And more specifically, what we're focusing on for the purposes of the Hub are standards that are developed by recognized standard development organizations, especially SDOs working at the international level. Now, some of you may be familiar with SDOs, others may hear the term for the first time. We have a few examples of prominent SDOs on the slide. The perhaps most prominent one is ISO, and many of you may have come across ISO standards previously, but there are many other SDOs active at the international level, and it's the work of those organizations, the standards that they produce, that will be at the core of the Hub's attention. Now, those kinds of standards can be contrasted with other standards developed by other types of organizations, such as regulatory standards or professional standards. So just to clarify, we are of course interested in the broader landscape of AI governance, but the focus will be on the work carried out through standard development organizations. The development of standards through SDOs is characterized by a number of principles. It's a stakeholder-driven process. The details of the process differ, but it is generally a stakeholder-driven process. Those standards tend to be, or generally are voluntary, that's important to mention, but standards developed by SDOs can also have important connections to regulation and legislation, and that's a topic we'll come back to later on, and I'm also sure we'll touch on during the discussion. Another characteristic of standards developed by SDOs is that standardization produced or developed in those organizations has a long history and in many ways permeates our lives, whether we are aware of it in our day-to-day activities or not. So just to provide some examples for those of you less familiar with standardization, this is sort of a non-exhaustive list and sort of a more or less random list with prominent examples. Paper sizes are one example. So whenever we use printing paper, the format and shape of that printing paper adheres to international standards that are, have been agreed on by SDOs. Standards historically play an important role for the safety of electrical equipment. Also, for example, simply the shape of power plugs, making sure that power plugs can be used consistently in a given jurisdiction. In the digital sphere, when it comes to digital technologies, prominent examples of the use of standards in the past include digital file formats. So, for example, the format of digital image files, making sure that those are interoperable. And wireless communication, standardizing the specifications of wireless communication systems and the rules that they adhere to. So all of this is simply to illustrate sort of the significance of standards across our lives, many areas of life. And what's relevant to the work of the AI Standards Hub is that SDOs, the kinds of organizations that I just described, increasingly turn their attention to AI as a technology and have started to develop standards for AI. And so that those standards will be the focus of our initiative. Now, another few words about the significance of standards in general terms before we move on to AI. Again, for those of you who may not be very familiar with standardization as an area. It's important to highlight, and this is really the background for the Hub as an initiative, that standardization can serve a variety of purposes and can have a variety of benefits. This is a non-exhaustive list highlighting just a few of those purposes. One important purpose, of course, is the use of standards to ensure and also to signal product quality, product safety, and trustworthiness. In addition to that, standards can play an important role for achieving interoperability. So going back to the previous example of file formats or wireless communication, for example. They can play an important role in increasing efficiency in business practices and they can facilitate international trade. It's also worth mentioning, as I previously already alluded to, that there can be important links between standards on the one hand and other governance mechanisms. One example for that is the use of standards as a basis for third-party certification, sort of seals that demonstrate through third-party verification that a standard has been adhered to. But it also includes connections to legislation and regulation and the use of standards to facilitate compliance with regulatory requirements. Now, leaving behind the general introduction to standardization and moving on to the context of AI, what is the motivation for this new initiative? Why do we see the need for an initiative that's dedicated to standardization as it relates to AI technologies? There are three main factors, really, that stand in the background of the work that we're pursuing. And I'll briefly say a few words about each of them. The first factor is the fact that standards for AI, standardization for AI, is increasingly important both as a governance mechanism but also an innovation mechanism for AI technologies. There are a number of policy developments that contribute to that trend and that highlight the significance of standardization for AI from those perspectives. At the domestic level, that includes the National AI Strategy, the government's plan for digital regulation, and also the CDI's recently published AI assurance roadmap. So those are all examples of policy work that emphasizes the increasing importance of standards in the AI context. There are also important developments at the international level. And the probably most prominent example here is the AI Act that's being proposed by the EU Commission, which is structured in a way that a lot of the detailed sort of requirements or making sense of the requirements set out in the EU AI Act will be a matter of work that's carried out in standard development organizations at the European level. So that's the first motivation, in the increased importance of standards in the AI context. Secondly, the fact that AI standardization touches on the interests of a diverse range of stakeholders, many different stakeholder groups. Again, sort of a non-exhaustive list to illustrate this. It's very obvious that standardization for AI touches on developers and buyers and users of AI in terms of making sure that standards are suitable for ensuring good practice and communicating good practice. But it's equally clear that standardization touches on the interests of consumers, civil society, regulators, policymakers, and also academic researchers. Academic researchers, for example, will have an interest to inform the shaping of standards, but also to use standards to ensure that research can be translated into industrial applications. Now, this fact, the fact that standardization touches on the interests of many stakeholders, in a sense, isn't unique to the AI context, but it's a fact that's particularly salient in the AI context for a number of reasons. And the main reason is the fact that AI systems, in many cases, raise significant questions around societal implications, societal concerns, ethical considerations. Those considerations can be more prominent in the AI context compared to other technology contexts, and as a result, the interests of consumers, regulators, and policymakers are particularly relevant in this context of standardization. And a third and final factor is the fact that the AI standardization landscape is increasingly complex, rapidly evolving, and difficult to navigate. So there is increasing importance across these stakeholder groups of the importance of standardization, but given the large number of SDOs working in the space and the large number of projects each of them are pursuing, it's increasingly difficult for stakeholders to keep track of developments and to decide where they should engage. And these three factors together, the increased importance, the multi-stakeholder nature of the interests affected, and the increased complexity of the landscape, give rise to the motivation for the hub and to the hub's mission. The hub's mission, in a nutshell, is to empower stakeholders to navigate the international AI standardization landscape, to become actively involved in it. And that includes empowering stakeholders to participate in the development of standards, but also to be able to make informed use of standards or to judge the adequacy of standards once they have been published. And throughout this work, throughout our pursuit of this mission, we take an explicitly multi-stakeholder approach that includes thinking about the interests and needs of industry, civil society, regulators, and academia. Now, to conclude, a few words about how we are planning to pursue that mission. At a very high level, we envisage that the hub will pursue 4 areas of activity, and I'll briefly say a few words about each of those areas. The backbone for all of those activities will be a new website that we're currently developing, and so once the website goes live, you will see each of those pillars reflected in the website. The first pillar is what we are calling the AI Standards Observatory, and that will be an online database of relevant standards, both standards under development and standards that have been published, and a way for website users to browse the database and identify standards that are particularly relevant to them. Secondly, there will be a pillar focused on connecting and community building, bringing stakeholders together to enable discussions around AI standardization and identified shared interests. Thirdly, there'll be a pillar focused on education, training, and professional development, where the hub will seek to provide knowledge and skills that are needed, be it in order to actively participate in the development of standards or to make use of standards once they have been published. And then finally, there's a pillar focused on research and analysis, where the hub will pursue research on issues such as analyzing gaps in the AI standardization landscape, making recommendations about standardization priorities, and so on at a strategic level. So that, in a nutshell, is what we are planning to do, the motivation behind it, and how we're planning to do it. But most importantly, as I mentioned, we are only at the beginning of this work, and we very much hope that you are going to join us in turning this work into a reality and join us in achieving our mission. So for that purpose, as I mentioned, we have set up an online form that we're sharing the link for on the screen. You will also find the link in the chat on the Hopin platform. And we'd like to invite you to complete that form, on the one hand, to register your contact details and receive updates about the hub's work, including the website once it goes live. The form also provides an optional opportunity to provide different information that will help us shape the hub and identify the priorities that the hub should be pursuing in its initial phase, and more broadly, opportunities to provide feedback to the AI standards team. So I'll end my presentation here by sharing this link and sort of inviting you all to join us in our journey of building the AI Standards Hub community. And it is now a pleasure to be able to welcome our 3 guests, as I mentioned. We have 3 guests with us today to discuss the AI Standards Hub. With us, 3 guests from our partner organizations, DCMS, the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sports, the British Standards Institution, and the National Physical Laboratory. I'll briefly introduce each of them. From DCMS, we have Stephanie Ifayemi, who is the head of digital standards policy in DCMS. And as part of her role, Stephanie leads the government's work on AI technical standards and the delivery of related objectives in the National AI Strategy. David Kukow is the Associate Director for Digital at the British Standards Institution. In his role, he's responsible for the national standards body's global strategy on all things digital and the development and implementation of the sector's market engagement. And finally, Sandeep Bandari is the strategy manager for the digital sector at the National Physical Laboratory. Sandeep's work focuses on shaping the evolution of physical metrology and measurement into the cyber-physical world, advancing the use of measurement to achieve confidence in data and digital technologies. So a warm welcome to all 3 of you. We've been working together for quite a while, but we haven't been on a public stage together, so it's very nice to be able to do this together today. Thank you for joining us. I think I'd like to start with a fairly general question for each of you, an invitation to describe where each of your organizations is coming from in working on standardization and in thinking about and contributing to the Standards Hub, including sort of for those who may be less familiar with the work of BSI and NPL, an introduction of where your organizations fit in the standardization landscape and the role that your organizations play. Let's start with Stephanie, and sort of a invitation for you to tell us a bit more about the government's general perspective on standardization from a policy perspective.
Awesome. Hi all, and fantastic presentation, Florian. So I'm Stephanie Fayemi, as Florian just mentioned, the head of digital standards policy at DCMS. And I think government sort of plays a sort of increasingly sort of important role in this space. One of our key objectives is really ensuring that we can strengthen the multi-stakeholder industry-led model of digital technical standards, and ensuring that we can sort of engage in the development of standards for critically important technologies, and ensuring that stakeholders have the tools to sort of engage at the global stage for AI, but also in other emerging technology areas such as quantum. But I think three strategies, that I think set out government sort of objectives and how we're approaching digital standards in this space is really important to think about how we are approaching AI technical standards. So we almost have this sort of top layer framework for what we're doing in this area overall, and that sort of trickles down to inform what we're doing on AI specifically. So those three document strategies being the first, the integrated review, the second, what we're doing on the G7, and the third is the digital regulation plan that Florian spoke about earlier. So the integrated review, many of you will be familiar, which is a critically important strategy for government in terms of setting our approach to sort of foreign policy for the coming years. And 2 points that were made in that strategy are the first being that government wants to sort of bring together other governments, standards bodies, industry, and others to sort of shape the rules, norms, and standards around sort of critical emerging technologies such as AI. But a second point that is maybe more important here is around ensuring that transparency and accountability are embedded at the outset in sort of the design and deployment of new technologies, including AI. So that's sort of a key sort of position point for us. Second is the G7. So during the UK's G7 presidency, we agreed to the framework for collaboration on digital technical standards with G7 partners. And this was also signed up to by the Republic of Korea and Australia. But the key part of that, and I'm sure we'll come back to this throughout the meeting, is ensuring that we give stakeholders the tools to share, coordinate, and empower them to engage at the global level. And it's fundamentally sort of premised on the idea that we need strong multi-stakeholderism in the technical standard space. And I think AI is an important area, and I can imagine that you can see already the synergies around the G7 work and the hub. And then the last point to just mention very quickly is the digital regulation plan. So one of the key sort of points we landed in that strategy was around the role of technical standards supporting traditional approaches to regulation. So how do we ensure that we can give sort of stakeholders the tools to know how to sort of conform to regulation, but also is there a world in which standards might replace sort of regulation if that was something that was sort of a valuable approach to take. So I'll stop there, but I think that those sort of set the scene, and then we'll come back to the national AI strategy during the other questions. Thanks, Florian.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And yeah, that's a great overview to kick us off. I'm sure we'll come back to several of those points later on. David, over to you. Tell us a bit more about BSI's role in the standardization context in general and the angle that you're coming from.
Well, first to say, Florian, it is fantastic to be here. As you said earlier, we've been working together now probably for more than 6 months. And this is the first time we've actually met. So it's super to be here and super to be supporting and working with you and other partners, including DCMS, on developing and launching the hub. I guess for those who don't know who BSI are, and I assume some don't on the audience, a very brief background. So we are the British Standards Institution. We are the UK's national standards body. There is only one of us. We're appointed by government. We have a royal charter. We've been around for around 115 years, writing standards across a very broad range, as Florian touched on earlier. You know, one day we can be writing safety standards on bouncy castles all the way through to quite sort of complex sort of biomedical devices. We have an MOU with government. We represent and support the UK economy, but also represent UK interests. So that's all of the stakeholders into all of those international standards organisations that Florian mentioned earlier, the formal ones being ISO, IEC, CEN, CENELEC, ETSI, supporting government's engagement with the ITU, but also working across those kind of fora and consortia that are out there looking to develop sort of early stage innovation and good practice to try and bring that into the kind of more formal standards world, both nationally and internationally. My team are very focused on digital standards, so we have around 40 committees working on both national and international standards. Again, very diverse, from cybersecurity through to blockchain, AI, cloud, and others. And we're also responsible for setting the strategy, but also going and engaging with UK stakeholders and government to try and identify, as Stephanie said, those kind of new areas that are coming down the line, such as quantum, where we'll need to start to think about capturing that good practice and developing into both national and international standards. On the AI piece specifically, our journey in AI standards probably started around 6 years ago out of some of the work that we're doing in cloud, big data and blockchain standardization, where we started to convene the community internationally to start thinking about the need for standards and standardization in AI. And there are a number of existing programs that are going on looking at things like concepts and definition, ethics, bias, but also we're looking at the management systems of AI themselves, and a new standard will be coming out next year, ISO 41000, which will be the management system standard internationally, which will help organisations be compliant when they're out there. They're developing and deploying AI systems.
Thank you very much. Sunny, over to you with sort of a quick overview of NPL's role in this and where you're coming from.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just to echo what David just said, it's just great to be out of the house and actually meeting people that I've been working with for so long. The National Physical Laboratory is the UK's National Measurement Institute. We've been in existence for about 120 years plus, and it's all about international traceability. So to really break that down is my pint of beer actually a pint, and is that bag of sugar actually a kilogram? So what we're able to do is actually hold the highest point of reference and traceability for these measurement standards. That's great if it's a kilogram or an amp or a second, because those are physical things that we can hold. But how do you measure things in a digital world? How would I, if I ever needed to, stand up in a court of law and defend a decision that I've just made based upon a set of data? Or more likely that my AI algorithm just wrote a program to make that decision itself. So where is the confidence that we need to entrust that to happen? So we're about 1,200 scientists. As I said, we've been around for 120 years. Very much now looking at, so I talked about the physical assets that we have in place, but where are those digital assets? And what is it we need to be doing now to be thinking about the future? Where NPL sits in the national quality infrastructure is, depending on which way you look at it, we do a lot of the research up to 2 to 10 years before it gets towards BSI. There's also another way which it works backwards, where we've got the standards and then NPL then goes and measures what it says on the tin. So we do a lot of measurement science. I could talk for quite some time, but it really is about how do we have confidence in that data to make intelligent and effective use of it.
Great, thank you very much for that. And I think sort of this hopefully gives everyone, you know, an overview of sort of how our organization's missions fit together really in, you know, supporting the hub's, you know, the hub's work and bringing together the relevant communities in the UK to advance standardization for AI. So the Turing sort of with its central place in the AI ecosystem and its, you know, source of expertise on AI, also as a convener for the AI community, as a bridge between academic research and in applications in industry and beyond, BSI as the national standards body, and NPL as the National Measurement Institute. And Steph, you told us sort of, you know, where this all fits in with the government's wider strategy. Let's maybe dive a bit deeper into, you know, some of the more specific motivations for our work, and maybe we can sort of combine two aspects. The first one being, you know, what exactly do we see as the main drivers for the increased importance of standards for AI? Where, you know, what's driving the increased attention, and what are some of the priority needs for AI standardization? And then also thinking about the challenges that stakeholders face in you know, in navigating that landscape and making sense of it all and actively engaging with it. Stephanie, over to you.
Awesome, thanks, Florian. So actually, when just thinking about your question there, what comes to my mind is actually sort of outcomes. And I think the reason why is really standards in themselves aren't the sort of end goal to some extent. They're not necessarily important just as single entities. I think the importance of standards comes from what they mean is in terms of them being sort of best practice tools that allow us to reach certain ends to some extent. And so I think when we're thinking about sort of what are the main factors driving the importance for AI standardizations, it's really about what are the outcomes potentially we want to achieve with this technology and how can standards help us sort of get to that endpoint. And I think that that's something that we are definitely thinking about on government side. And so I know, and there are different types of standards, of course. So two sort of important points to make there in terms of how standards can help us is if we think about foundational standards, and Sani, what you just mentioned from a metrology point of view, how do we define or how do we sort of translate principles and things we're doing in terms of engaging at the OECD on the AI principles and other fora into sort of codified technical specifications. And that's one example of how technical standards can help us achieve that end. Or we have sort of process standards, of course. So David, you just mentioned the 42001 sort of management system standard. The outcome being that we want to understand how we can best manage risk or test for risk. And again, standards help us achieve that goal. And so I think really thinking about what are the outcomes we want to achieve and how standards play a sort of facilitation role is really a sort of useful way to think about it. So when we were coming into the AI strategy, the national AI strategy, we actually set out a few points. So I'll talk about two things. One, that we actually put the AI standards sort of text in the AI strategy under the third pillar. So the AI strategy sort of splits into three sort of core pillars. The third is around governing AI effectively, and that's actually where you'll find the text on standards, and I'll come onto that in a second. But we also set out a few ends in which we thought were pretty important to achieve and how, therefore, standards might help us to get there. The first is around supporting sort of R&D and innovation. And I think that that is sort of something and a driving factor outcome that many want to achieve. How do we ensure that we can take the strength of the sort of R&D we're doing in this space and translate that into specifications? I think that that's an important role for standards. Supporting trade, I'm sure BSI might touch on this, but how do we ensure that we sort of minimize the sort of cost of applying regulatory requirements and reduce technical barriers to trade? And that's again where technical standards can help. The third, giving UK businesses more opportunities to sort of scale internationally. The fourth is around delivering safety, security, and trust. And I think that this very much overlaps with the governance point. So I won't dive into this now, I'll come back to it. And then the last is, I think, Florian, you mentioned this in your presentation around supporting conformity assessments. Once you have a stamp of best practice, and that can underpin how you sort of get a stamp of a mark that shows that you've been sort of certified, that you're reaching a certain level of practice. I think that that's also where standards can help. So hopefully that sort of answers your question, Florian. But I think just to quickly touch on why I think technical standards were included in the third chapter of the AI strategy, that's really about pulling out governance as an outcome that we're really, of course, thinking about as government. And at the moment, we are in the process of drafting the white paper on the UK's approach to governing and regulating AI. And we put in the strategy that we see technical standards as part of that wider picture. I think that the goal, therefore, being that we want to ensure that AI benefits citizens, benefits business, and then therefore thinking about how the technical standards support us from a sort of governance perspective to mitigate harms. And that's where the AI Standards Hub comes in very much. So I think thinking about the governance picture and going back to the strategies I mentioned at the outset, how do we sort of think about the hub as sort of getting more multi-stakeholder folks in this space? How do we ensure that we are sort of contributing and translating that R&D for innovation into technical standards, again, using the hub? So I think the approach that government took was to think about these outcomes that we want to achieve, put them in the strategy, and that's when we announced that we would want to pilot the hub, and we're just very excited that we're sort of working with Turing, BSI and MPL to sort of take that forward. In terms of the specific challenges that stakeholders are facing, I will pass to BSI and MPL. I do have a few thoughts on that, but I will pass on to any thoughts before diving in.
Thank you, Stephanie, and we'll come back to you on that question. Thanks for those comments. And I think one thing that you highlighted very helpfully at the beginning is sort of the diverse range of different types of standards. The different types of content that may be contained in a standard. One question that often comes up in discussions about AI standardization is AI mature enough as a technology for standardization, right? And I think that question sometimes ignores the diverse range of types of standards that may be relevant, and the fact that some of those standards, as you mentioned, foundational standards that may simply set out definitions, and it's very important, in terms of facilitating innovation, to have shared definitions, or measurement standards, that those kinds of standards may be relevant at a very early stage of innovation already. And I'm sure, David, you can tell us a bit more about, for example, the organizational standards, that are equally relevant. So all of that to say, sometimes we use the term technical standards, but that doesn't really capture, the diverse types of content, right? The standards we're talking about don't necessarily need to be technical in their substance. They can often be about risk management processes, and very simply definitions in some cases. But I'll pass over to you, David, sort of for some further thinking from your side.
Those questions.
Yeah.
I think, let me just pick on the question you raised there about the level of maturity of AI. I would argue maybe we're already too late in starting the process. AI is already being used. We're already seeing challenges, things like facial recognition, algorithms to look at recruitment process, algorithms decide on exam results. And I think what's interesting about AI, it probably the first time in any kind of technology area, we started to consider right at the outset the kind of social economic impact of the technology. And I think that's really interesting, and I think clearly that's where standards and good practice can have a really fundamental role in ensuring that we're learning those lessons from the past in terms of social media and online harms, where we're sort of playing catch up as the kind of technology gets deployed. There is clearly a challenge with that in the fact that we will need to be really, really diverse and very agile in the way we capture and develop good practice and standardization, because the technology will evolve very, very rapidly as it gets deployed out into kind of different applications. We will start to find out, what the impact of this technology is sort of over time. So we'll need to be very fleet of foot, certainly in our development of standards and standardization, to ensure that it keeps up with the pace of change. but also that will have obviously a knock-on impact on the regulatory environment and our policy decisions from a government perspective. I think that's really, really important for us to kind of consider as we go forward. You're absolutely right in terms of, standards aren't just technical standards. I think there's a bit of confusion out there in the thinking, well, actually, standards are all about the kind of interface and the technology bit. And if you actually look at how we use and apply technology such as AI and how we digitally transform our organisations, we sometimes get very focused on the technology. And as Stephanie says, we don't necessarily look at the outcome. And the outcome is what we need to be looking at first. And when we start to consider the outcome, whatever that outcome is, as we go through that transformational process, there is a number of areas that are impacted. And that is people, culture, systems, trust, brand, and all these things are non-technical considerations. Procurement is another example. And these are all areas where standardization are critical in ensuring that we can deploy these technologies in a safe and ethical way and allow us to accelerate the advancement of using these technologies for the good of the economy, but also for the good of society.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Sunny, I'm sure you have thoughts to add from your side.
Yeah, so we have a similar situation, I guess, in the whole quantum technologies field. And when is it too early? When is it too late? In fact, that difference could be overnight. So we do need to start thinking about this already. And I think David hit the key word for me, which is this thing about digital transformation. So whilst the UK might be the world's greatest online shoppers, how do we really engage in confidence with anything that's got the word smart in front of it? So how do I get in that autonomous vehicle and know that it will get me from point A to point B? Because that's, in my opinion, a safety critical application. So there's a lot of work to be done and think about, and I think also the standards have a big role to play in enabling us to innovate with confidence, invest, to trade, to make, to manufacture. There's lots of things where these standards have a lot of role. For me personally, why are we doing this? Why are we investing taxpayers' money into this? And it's about value to our society and what we can get, because when we do have our own journey of digital transformation, it's about productivity, it's about efficiency, about making my life better, making those around me better. So there's a lot of work to do. I mean, just to put it into context, I was reading, I think yesterday, we probably interact as normal people with AI already 350 to 400 times per day. And that's using your iPhone, it's using basic technology. That's only going to grow. I mean, these technologies are changing overnight. It's changed from 3, 4 to 7 different types of AI. And then I won't even want to estimate how many tools sit under each of those, because there will be hundreds. But which one is the right tool? Which one is going to enable that business critical or safety critical application to happen? Because at the moment, these are very large prediction machines that can do things at scale. But when we get to the next level, then we'll really need to be confident in that, and work needs to start now, because it could take anywhere from 2 to 10 years from the NPL perspective of doing the research in that.
Great, thank you very much, Sunny. So I think we've covered sort of the case for the Standards Hub quite well, and the case for the importance of that work. Let's talk a bit more about the obstacles, in terms of getting there. And I think in part it'd be useful to come back to the question of different stakeholders who have interest in relation to AI standardization, and the extent to which they are traditionally involved, the extent to which there's a need for efforts to increase the inclusivity of those processes. I've also been keeping an eye on the online questions, and I think one question that got a particularly large number of upvotes is around a perception that I think is quite common, that international standards, their shape is often driven by large economies and stakeholder perspective from large economies. Of course, in the technology context, that might be the United States or China. There's a question: how can we make sure and how can we increase the relevance of the UK in those fora? So maybe we'll do the usual round. We'll start with you, Steph.
Awesome, thanks, Florian, and a great question from the audience. I think something that, Sunny, you just touched on, and Florian, you raised in your follow-up earlier, was the idea of the sort of nascency of this space, and therefore when should we standardize. I think one of the things we actually put in the integrated view, not to go back to the outset, but I think it's important, that framework that is very much informing how government's coming into the space, was the idea of sort of getting in early. And one of the key words in the strategy is really about shaping transparency, accountability, et cetera, at the outset. And so I definitely agree that sort of the importance is sort of getting in early in this space. And I'll come back to this idea of how does the UK sort of engage effectively. But in terms of what the challenges mean of getting in early, is that there isn't sort of an agreement per se internationally as to what we should be focusing on. And I think that those are the types of discussions we need to have, and also the types of support that we might want to give stakeholders in terms of the challenges that they have. How do I know where to go? There are many, many SDOs globally. And within those SDOs, we have horizontal topics. So you might have accountability that's talking about a number of sort of areas. So accountability for healthcare, robotics, et cetera, all in one sort of meeting. But then you can also have accountability discussions that are focused on a specific sector vertical area. And again, if I'm a large company, if I'm an SME or an academic, how do I know where to spend my time and my money to some extent in these forums? And so I think that's one of the challenges, navigating the complexity. That's a key driver. How that informed what we said in the National AI Strategy was that the hub might be able to resolve that, and also having a toolkit. So training essentially that helps people understand where they might want to engage, but also to understand different parts of standardization in more detail. So a second point is, given the nascency of AI standards, you might have a particular focus on sort of foundational standards at this point, but you might not have folks that have a background in metrology and the work that sort of MPL is doing so much great work on. So is there a way to sort of upskill people to understand the different types of standards they might engage and contribute their expertise to? So I think that those two key points, I'm sure BSI and MPL have some more to add to that. And then in terms of how we can increase sort of UK voices in SDOs, I think the global SDO landscape, of course, is engaged in by a number of countries, a number of stakeholders, industry players and others. And I think that's definitely what the hub is. I think that question is interesting because it's, I think, just a sort of chain link to why we've sort of developed the hub. How do we, I think the functions of the hub that Florian mentioned at the outset, I think the potential ways to follow up to that question. One, and it goes back to the challenges as well, tracking AI standards and having a repository. People might know, okay, these are the key standards for these sort of outcome things I might want to achieve. So if I'm interested in risk, these are the standards I should be following. Convening discussions. And so I think if we are able to sort of bring UK stakeholders together to sort of think about what are the challenges we face, how can we perform effectively better, the second sort of function of the hub might help to resolve this question around how do we get more UK stakeholders engaged. And then the third, again, I won't spend too much time on this, but training. In order for us to engage more effectively internationally, that's where the training function is, and giving us the tools to do that better. The last point I should mention is that the research and analysis point that you mentioned, Florian, something that we did put in the press release in January is that we are keen to explore how the hub joins up and aligns with similar initiatives globally. So there definitely is also an encouragement for us to be working more closely with our international partners in this space. It isn't sort of a siloed UK sort of hub. We definitely want to think about the US, Australia, Canada, other folks and G7 partners, for example. So that question is very interesting, having a UK voice, but also ensuring that that's grounded in sort of collaboration with our partners as well, I think is very important. But on that note, I will pass back to you all in the sort of studio.
That's great. Thank you, Stephanie. We're already down to the last 5 minutes, so I won't say much and pass straight on to David.
I shall try and be brief. On the international aspect, yes, it's true that there are countries out there with very large voices. I think that is because they have recognised the importance of standards and standardisation to drive their own initiatives internationally. And of course, AI is borderless. It's an international technology. But I think what the hub can do and what we can do better is that kind of single voice. If we can have a more coordinated, joined up, broader multi-stakeholder view of the requirements for best practice and standardization and coordinate their voice internationally, clearly we are going to have a bigger voice as the UK in those international markets, and we are a leading country. Alan Turing is recognised as a leader in data science and AI technologies. BSI is recognised as a global leader and a trusted partner in standardisation and MPL in the meteorology world. So I think we can be that sort of single voice, but we need to engage that kind of multi-stakeholder view of getting more organisations involved in helping support the development of standardisation. And I think that sort of sharing knowledge repository, that enduring information repository for the UK will help us have a larger voice out there on the international stage.
Thank you, David. And over to you, Sunny.
So, yeah, it's completely on the same page as David, to be honest. I guess one person's standard is different from somebody else's. So that very first or second slide you showed where we have all the various stakeholders. So if I'm one of those stakeholders, obviously I wear multiple hats because I'm interested in different things. Which standards body do I go to? And to say what? Because at one side you've got the large industries at the very technical fora, but then you've got other places where we're talking about ethics and bias and what that means to civil society. So it's a bit of figuring out where I go and how I go to these various places. AI is definitely borderless. If we think about standards moving forward, and without going into too much detail, think about geopolitics and the four internets that Dame Wendy wrote so nicely about quite a few years ago. Some areas are concentrating on security and privacy. Some places are innovate first and we'll worry about the standards later. Others look at it from different perspectives. I think the UK has a good position in that we look at it from our multiple stakeholders' perspectives, but then we have the ethical, legal, and regulatory frameworks in place. So it could be a nice convening spot globally to put all of these things together. I think from the measurement perspective, because we're part of this international community that signed up to the International Meter Convention, we have to work internationally. So conversations with the countries and our equivalents across the world, like the National Institute for Standards and Technology in America, PTB, and the other countries that Steph mentioned, we're having those discussions right now because we can't do this alone. Otherwise, you won't have that traceable chain and that confidence throughout that process globally.
Great. Thank you very much for that. In many ways, we've only sort of scratched the surface of these topics, and we could be sitting here for another few hours to go deeper. But unfortunately, we're approaching the end of the session. I don't think that's it is sad, but in many ways, the good news is that we're really at the beginning of the journey with the hub, and there will be plenty of opportunities going forward to have more detailed discussions. I also thought it'd be worth briefly mentioning, online there have been a few other questions. Apologies to those whose questions we weren't able to address. Quite a few questions touched on, the issue of which types of standards should be prioritized, what kinds of standards are needed or would add the most value. And I think those are really the core questions. In many ways, they are open questions at the moment, and those are exactly the questions that the Standards Hub
Join the hub.
We'll try to find answers for. And so we'll very much hope that you'll join us in this endeavor to find the right answers to those questions. Stephanie mentioned earlier the contrast, for example, between horizontal and vertical standards. So the horizontal standards that apply to AI use across sectors, or verticals that apply to either particular industries or particular use cases. And the right mix of that is really, I think, an open question at this stage. It's in many ways a question that's reflected also in regulatory debates. In regulation for AI, we also have the question to what extent regulation should cut across horizontally as opposed to being vertical. So in a sense, it's a question. If you're interested in that particular point, I'd encourage you to stay on for the next session, because I'm sure we'll come back to that in the regulation discussion. But so lots of interesting questions. We hope you'll join us on the journey in finding the right answers to that. Please do sign up to our expression of interest form so we can keep you up to date as the work advances, especially once the website goes live. And help us spread the word and hopefully will cross paths as the AI Standards Hub's work evolves. Thank you very much to the three of you, Stephanie, David, and Sunny, for joining us. Thank you to all of those watching for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.